Welcome to #52Needs, and this week we're exploring movement. And I have with me Richmond Heath, who's a physiotherapist and the national coordinator of TRE in Australia. He has a diverse background in innovative health initiatives, including online suicide prevention, and he is also the co-founder of the Online Men's Gathering. Since introducing TRE to Australia and New Zealand in 2010, Richmond has provided community recovery workshops for survivors of Black Saturday, the Ipswich Floods, and the Christchurch Earthquake, as well as training more than 2,500 people in the use of spontaneous involuntary movement to optimize their mental health and physical well-being. Welcome, Richmond. So before we start, let's clarify TRE.
So look, TRE originally stood for trauma release exercises, and then it became, because David Berselli, the founder, was seeing spontaneous shaking and tremoring in the context of war zones and natural disasters and seeing it as a recovery response. When he started sharing this technique back in the US and sort of Western countries that weren't necessarily in a quote sort of trauma space, people started to report, they go, my neck is feeling better, I'm sleeping better, all these different things. So it started becoming known as tension and trauma release exercises. For me now, I tend to just call it TRE, and I don't attach anything to it because there's spontaneous movements sometimes have nothing to do with releasing tension and trauma. So for example, every single one of us listening to this interview at the moment spent 9 months in utero with our body spontaneously shaking and tremoring with nothing to do with releasing stress and tension or recovering from trauma, but actually it's got to do with how our body organizes and grows our nervous system. So I tend to these days, Angela, just call it TRE in the same way that people don't know what IBM stands for, but you know it's computers. People don't know what DNA stands for, but you kind of know what it is. So I tend to just say, look, this is TRE, and it's this spontaneous involuntary movement process that we're deliberately working with in the body.
Okay. So there are involuntary movements and then there are conscious movement. I know that we are born nomads, right? So our ancestors, our nomadic ancestors used to walk, from what I gather, about 10 to 15 kilometers every day. There was movement. And I know that you've talked about the Kalahari, who were the shake masters.
They call themselves the keepers of the shake. It's part of their key cultural identity.
That's right. So the Kalahari they move a lot, but they still feel the need to have the involuntary shaking as well. So why are both important?
Look, it's a great question. So, and I really like this way of framing it. When you said 52 needs and we're going movement is one, I really like that we're kind of going 52, or I don't know what number this is in the series, but let's call it 41. And we've got 41A, which is movement, which we all think of as movement, which is I'm moving my arm, I'm doing my yoga, I'm doing my Pilates, I'm walking. And that's conscious volitional movement, which means that I'm consciously choosing to create that movement. And then 41B, this is something different. This is spontaneous involuntary movement. Now, in the practice of TRE, it seems like something quite different. Oh, we lie down, we fatigue the muscles a little bit, we start to connect with shaking and tremoring, or sometimes whole body movements and stretches, and the body starts moving itself. When we first experience that, we think, wow, this is weird. I'm not doing that, my body is doing it. But in a stress and tension and trauma release sort of aspect, we all naturally experience this. If we're public speaking and our body's a bit stressed, the hands start to shake and tremor, the voice starts to wobble, but we've misunderstood this in our Western culture as a symptom of stress and anxiety, rather than recognizing that it's a key part of the solution, where the shaking is actually dumping the adrenaline, releasing the muscular tension and bracing, and calming the nervous system. So this is something different from conscious movement, but it's also something completely normal. Every night we go to bed and our eyes go through a period of rapid eye movement where we know this helps us integrate memories and shift those body responses to the day's memory into long-term memory.
But we don't really allow for that. I mean, there's no conscious awareness of that anymore, because for example, I was in hospital one time and I had very complicated surgery, and I came out of this and I was shaking. I was literally shaking like a leaf. And the nurses were giving me one heated blanket after another. I mean, literally, I was absolutely smothered with blankets because there was the sense that I was cold and I needed to have some cuddling. And I never shook off whatever was going on. as it was pretty severe surgery. And I know that a few weeks later, I self-diagnosed, and I went to see a doctor about that, and with PTSD, because I had all of these repeated nightmares, and I was, I had all these really disturbing thoughts, and I was like, something's not quite right. And then I had car accidents, and that's when TRE came in, because I was able to release some trauma that I had located in my body that I didn't even know I had. But maybe you can tell us more about, because that's one thing that I found really fascinating about when women give birth and afterwards, and the connection between, and I love that story about with Africa and David Berceli. So if you can tell us more about that, that would be great.
Yeah, great. Look, what we're pointing to is purely that in our Western medical culture, we have misunderstood and pathologized this involuntary shaking response to do with stress and trauma. If you have a car accident and your hands are shaking, we think that's a sign of shock. If you have surgery and your body's shaking, we go, oh, that's a sign that you're cold. So again, if you're public speaking and your hands are shaking, we just say, why am my hands shaking? Because I'm scared. But in our Western scientific model, because we're so pathology focused, no one's ever said, hang on, what is the shaking and tremoring trying to achieve? Oh, actually, why are we shaking? What's it doing? And that partly comes because in our Western mental health model, we've separated the body and we have mental health and physical health. So the people who know about movement aren't really working in trauma and mental health. The people who are working in mental health and trauma don't really know about movement. So what we're talking about is normalizing and reinstating spontaneous movement back into its rightful place in this sense, in terms of as a release and a recovery response. So the story you were mentioning is David Berceli, the TRE founder, was teaching a group of 50 traditional Swahili midwives. So he was there and they're all lying on the floor and they're all shaking and tremoring. They're all speaking in Swahili. So on some level, he's thinking, here I am, I'm introducing TRE and this shaking response, and I'm introducing this new thing to these people. One of the women halfway through yells out in English, "Push, mama, push." And the whole room erupts in laughter. Now, David had no idea what, because they were all speaking Swahili. So afterwards he said, why did you say that? And what was so funny about it? They had translators, obviously. And this traditional Swahili midwife, she said, you white doctors, we know all about these tremors. And she went on to explain that in their traditional birth culture, where the women will give birth standing up, being supported, because that's generally an easier position than our Western one, where we lie down and make it easy for the doctor. And she said, we will not let that woman lie down after birth, sometimes for up to half an hour, while her body goes through this shaking and tremoring discharge. Because she said, we know if we don't let that happen, that woman is going to end up with problems afterwards. Now, the classic sort of ignorance and arrogance of our Western medical model is we straight away say, well, hang on, has there been any research on that? Because unless I can read that in a paper and it's being double-blind studied, and I'm not saying that's wrong or bad, but we'll say, well, that's obviously not true. Whereas here's a culture, just one example of many, who have observed and said, when we allow this to happen over hundreds, if not thousands of years, we have observed that if we don't allow this natural discharge, we're going to have post-traumatic symptoms. So they don't need the research, because the research is there in front of them. And another beautiful example, a similar thing, Angela, is Peter Levine, who is the founder of somatic experiencing, which is a very therapeutic model of using the shaking and tremoring reflex. When he first kind of got introduced to it, it was by African gamekeepers who were explaining to him that after they'd captured an animal and it had been tranquilized, and then they released it back into the wild, these gamekeepers said, if that animal, when it comes out of, like you had after coming out of surgery, coming back to life, similar to coming out of hibernation, they said if that animal shakes and tremors when it comes back to life and before it gets out of the cage and goes out, that animal will live. But if it does not do that, that animal will die, because it's still in an immobility response, or it's still patterned in a deep bracing and holding response that's not bringing it back to life. So there's already, around the world, there are many cultures and many different modalities. Katsujin Undo from Japan, the ancient samurai used Seiki Jutsu. You've got Christian mystics who used all different sorts of shaking and tremoring. Fascinating thing, Native Americans, when they started to use this spontaneous shaking reflex, it was passed as a law in the United States Parliament that they were not allowed to do this shaking practice.
Really?
So this is the thing. And from a young child, right, if you've got young children or you remember reading children's books, in just about every second or third books, there will be a reference to shaking or trembling. The ugly duckling was all alone, trembling with fear. And in our culture, we automatically say the trembling is the fear. So from a young age, we are taught if I'm shaking, that's a sign I'm anxious or I'm scared. And it is sometimes, because it's showing us that we have been scared, but the shaking is not part of our fear response. It's part of our recovery response.
Yeah. So since we're talking about children, maybe we can just switch to the conscious movement just for a second, because I find it so interesting, and that when we are children, we learn with our whole body. We encourage children to move around. Well, we don't have to encourage them. They do. They naturally run around and they do things, which is probably why lockdown is really terrible for parents, to have children in small spaces where they can't go out. But when children move around and they learn, they integrate things in a different way than when they sit. I know there's something called state-dependent learning. So if a child studies for an exam lying on the floor, sitting on the armrest like this, listening to really loud music while they're studying, when they then finally sit at a desk in a totally different body position, and they're trying to recall the information while it's dead silent, they are not going to be able to do that because they have learned this in a certain state. So that's another kind of movement that's really important. And again, this whole thing of we're just sitting down, we're not shifting, we're just learning with the left half of our brain logically. Whereas when we move around and we engage in that, we absorb knowledge much, much better. So,
oh, look, yeah. And again, so it brings up so much around the enculturation that in our Western culture, we are from a young age trained to disconnect from our bodies, to ignore our bodies. Movement becomes physical education and PE, and we do that 2 hours a week.
And you get graded on the competence, not on the joy that you have. Because I always said to my teacher, I can't do this. I don't have depth perception, but can you give me an extra mark for the comical note?
Yeah.
No.
And, it makes me remember, Angela, when I went to primary school, we would line up in lines in our class, we would play the national anthem, and then we would march a lap around the netball court or wherever we were, the quadrangle. And I remember reading, I can't remember the exact reference, but one of the biggest impacts on improving IQ is doing exercise first thing in the day before kids go to school. So again, we've separated, 95% of the learning we do at school is intellectual. That's not necessarily wrong or bad, but we train ourselves to ignore the body, sit still, come out of that embodied learning. And I think, people then say, well, we've got kinesthetic learners, we've got auditory, we've got visual learners, and, there's like 75% visual, 25%, and kinesthetic is very small. But what we don't do is we don't say, hang on, that's when we look at who's learning kinesthetically in a culture where we've all been trained to not be kinesthetic.
Yeah.
And if you go to any Indigenous culture or any place where people are free, the kids are learning through movement, not just intellectual thinking skills, and it improves their movement. But, we train ourselves out of the body, we train our children out of the body, and then we assess them and say, look, well, here's the science. Look, most people are visual learners. Well, that's only because you've all been trained to not be kinesthetic, and we should all ultimately have the chance to be learning in all of those different ways at the same time.
Well, the person who actually developed this whole visual, auditory, kinesthetic learning actually said, John Grinder actually had a chat, and he said that's one of the biggest things he regrets, because we use all of these. He says the lead system, which is the visual, that is the lead system is now, I now learn visually, now I learn kinesthetically, changes every 30 seconds. So we use everything, and it depends on the context. Like if I watch a 3-hour video presentation, yes, well, then that will become my lead system. But if I naturally use everything that's involved, it'll change all the time. And then the learning is much more integrated. But we don't give ourselves the chance to do that anymore. We take movement completely out of the picture.
Well, it's so wonderful to hear that. I haven't heard that information before, and it's just such a beautiful example of. It's not saying that we need to not be visual learners. It's not saying that we don't need to do that, but we've forgotten the body. We want to bring the body with it. And look, there's lots of, they're seen as alternative ways of learning. So my children, when they were young, went to a Steiner school, which, has a lot of stigma about it. Oh, you're not going to learn your maths. You're not going to learn those things. And maybe they don't learn that as much, but the focus is on play and movement, very much for that first 7 years. So yeah, there are models, Montessori schools. There's lots more schools around the world that are using, one I love, and I've been working with some young kids at a school recently. And what do we all have to do? We spend all our time saying, stop rocking your chair. Don't rock on your chair. Whereas there are now schools that are getting chairs that rock because there is a need for movement. So, and it's often young boys. Why? Because they've got all this energy and they want to move. And we say, stop moving, come down and think. And so, it's great to see these things starting to open up. It's so lovely to hear. What was the name of the founder of that?
John Grinder is the founder of neurolinguistic programming. So
yeah. So that's so beautiful. And I would say that when you think about neuro-linguistic program, we so often focus on the linguistic part of it rather than the neuro. I would like to call it neuromuscular linguistic programming. So we incorporate the movement and the body and the muscular system back into our learning.
We can talk about that. John Grinder actually has a whole system on first access, secondary access, and he's really focused on the first access, which is all about the senses. But that's a whole new topic. But what I find really interesting is I love when I do training and face-to-face training with actual people in the room or online training. I generally, for online training, I keep it to a maximum of an hour and a half because it's just too hard otherwise. But I generally, even again, it doesn't matter which context, I have dance breaks. And people look at me, they go, are you kidding, right? And I do songs that everybody can play with, YMCA, and people are really going, oh, really, do we have to do this? And I go, yeah, we do. You move at your own rhythm, and you do, you don't have to do the YMCA, but get moving because, we're having a lot of information, and allow your body to actually process that. But it's almost shameful these days to move because, we don't learn to dance anymore. It's this, we go out and that's the kind of dancing. I love 5 rhythm dancing. I don't know if you've done that, but that's my way. I can go completely ballistic. So when it goes into chaos, I really let it rip because it's the best way to let go of stress.
So Angela, I've got a suggestion, because one is I want to go and grab a book from my bookshelf because I want to be able to reference it, especially about this embodied learning. And the second thing is we're talking about having these dance breaks and movement. Would you be able to give us all now one of those breaks for 30 seconds or whatever while I grab the book? And so we actually do the dance. We actually do the dance break while I get the book, so we don't just talk about it.
All right. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to do this in sitting because I don't really have enough room to move around here.
All right. I'll get my book and come back.
Okay. So you can move your arms, you can do this, you can do that, and turn on some music. Maybe I'll put some music underneath this. But you can jump up and down in your chair. You can just stretch your legs out, left, right, do some cross across the body is actually really good because that helps integrate learning. So if you really want to do it for fun, put one hand on your nose and then just clap and just come up the other way. So that's an integrative movement that allows your brain. This is called to integrate learning. That's called brain gym. But just move around. Just roll your shoulders, roll your arms, roll your ankles. And this is way more than 30 seconds, Richmond.
Sorry.
So keep going. Just move your body and just have some fun. And he's back and he hasn't found the book.
I haven't found the book. So what I will do, because it's a brilliant book about embodied cognition and learning.
Yeah.
I can picture it's a yellow and black cover, but I can't find it, but I will find it. And if we can put that in the link
below.
All right. So we'll forget that. We'll put in that. But what's fascinating is, and for me as well, I'm someone who tends to be very intellectual. I love information. So, I think it's so common that we wouldn't stop and do the actual body break, but I do find also for me that stimulation intellectually actually brings my body alive, and I feel the energy moving. I feel my body freeing up.
I can feel it right now.
Yeah. So It's also, I think it's useful that, so we often think I have to get out of the head to be in the body and movement. But for some of us, like for me, the more my mind starts to get excited and a lot more my body comes alive. So there's many avenues. And ultimately, like we're saying with the kinesthetic, auditory and visual, we want to have access to all of those so we can be, you know, fully human and fully ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds wonderful. I mean, look, we can talk about this for hours because there are just so many different aspects to movement and the need to really express ourselves through movement as well, both the involuntary and the voluntary. So thank you so much for your wisdom and for, my God, all of that information that you have. I would highly recommend that you work with Richmond. Do an online course if you can't get to him physically, but you are starting to have the physical workshops again. So if you can do it, please do a physical workshop. It's the best investment you will ever make.
So yeah, look, we are, since COVID, there's an online course where you can learn the TRE and the spontaneous movement, which is currently free, but it's probably going to become a paid course soon. So if you're hearing this now, check it out. And doing live workshops, as you say, working together in a group, there's a whole different feel when everybody's organism is all moving and calming together. And look, the only other thing I'll say, you are welcome to work with me, but I'm already really busy. There are TRE providers all around the world and all around Australia, you know, who are as excited about the process as we are and love introducing. So, you know, if you go onto the global website, which is traumaprevention.com, or in Australia, it's treaustralia.com, you'll be able to find TRE providers who will either be doing one-on-one sessions if you need that for whatever reason, or running groups, or even running workshops. And as Angela mentioned, you know, you can learn that in the group is a wonderful, wonderful way to do it as well. So yeah, look, thank you very much for having me. It's been fun, fun to chat.
And thank you everybody for watching, and I'll see you next week.